from University of Wisconsin-Madison last week that I find exciting. So there was a student who was posting notes on the College Republicans' office, the GOP Badger's office, that were identifying Trump as a racist and a bigot and a homophobe and a number of characterizations. And she just sort of quietly was putting those up. And it made it was a silent protest. She had some music with it, but she wasn't speaking. And the response from the GOP Badgers was this woman was intolerant, right? And anytime you've tweeted something, you say, you know, this policy is racist or homophobic, and you might hear in response, you know, you bigot, or the intolerant, the so-called tolerant left. So we utilize this term intolerance fairly broadly and in a wide variety of ways in our political discourse. It's usually an insult. It's also the case that some forms of intolerance are different than others. A civil rights law is technically intolerant of certain types of preferences or beliefs. So when we codify into law, you don't get to decide whom you hire based on how they pray or what color they are or what biology they have. It's an intolerance of that preference, right? And we don't consider that an insult. So what happens when there's a clash of types of tolerance? When you have a civil rights law that protects, particularly usually protected classes, from adverse decisions by, be it governments or businesses or other entities. And then you have liberties, particularly such as religious liberty, potentially in tension with that. So what we have is three speakers here to talk about that in the context of religious exemptions from civil rights laws. Fred GEDICKS from Brigham Young University was the principal author and counsel of record on a Supreme Court amicus brief filed for himself and 20 other church and state scholars in the Hobby Lobby case, in which a private business had argued for an exemption from the contraception mandate in the Affordable Care Act. So they did not want to provide contraception, and Professor GEDICKS led a group of church-state scholars explaining why they should not receive that exemption. Ultimately, the Hobby Lobby prevailed. Sarah Warbelow from the Human Rights Campaign is their legal director and on the front lines of legislative battles at the state and federal level, seeking exemptions or blocking civil rights laws aimed at protections for the LGBT community. And Kathleen Brady, associated with Emory University, has written, among other things, The Distinctiveness of American Religion and Law, Rethinking Religion Clause Jurisprudence. So I'm going to ask each of them, starting with Professor GEDICKS, to sort of set the stage with your sense of the state of things and what this audience should know.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and thanks to Professor Schwartz for that introduction. Where do we stand now? Such a hard thing to discuss in 60 minutes, let alone in 5 minutes. I think one of the things that I think the discussion lacks is careful attention to place, to the place where accommodation is sought. I think what I think are two of the easiest cases on one hand would be churches and religious congregations. The legal term is houses of worship. And at the other extreme are government offices, both physical offices and then the authority that people wield as government officials. I would say that obviously the criminal law applies to how a church runs its internal affairs, but otherwise we should give extraordinary deference to churches. That's reflected in the so-called ministerial exception. A church can choose whomever they please as its minister on whatever basis it wants. Ministerial decisions are exempt from all anti-discrimination laws. And I think that's appropriate because that decision and both the physical and the virtual place in which it occurs is quintessentially private space in the United States. We let people do what they want in their living rooms, at least we ought to. The criminal law applies, and of course there are dangers with saying something's private so the government can't intervene. I mean, for many years, family life was so private that there apparently was no role for law enforcement with respect to spousal and child abuse. But at least setting aside the criminal law, I think churches, that's a private space, and churches should be able to do what they want within that space, and people who dislike it can join another church or not go to that church. On the other hand, we take the other extreme, government offices and officials. This is the Kim Davis situation, the county clerk in Kentucky. I thought that her actions were wrong on multiple levels. But the most important one was if you're a government official, so I'm not talking about a cafeteria worker or a custodian or someone like that in a government building, but someone who wields government authority. That person needs to represent all the people in their jurisdiction. And I thought it was deeply wrong from a matter of political morality for someone to have been elected to represent all the people in a particular county of Kentucky, whose tax dollars are paying her salary from all the people, and then to say, sorry, I can't serve all the people. And to be, in particular, somewhat rigid in allowing other people in her office to serve those people. So I think those are the two, for me, those are the two easy situations. The hard ones are the ones in the middle, public accommodations, and religious nonprofits who serve large members of the public rather than simply those of their own faith. So, I mean, a religious hospital is sort of the classic example of that. I think I'm bumping up against 5 minutes, so I'll just leave those thoughts.
Well, I actually had a very similar approach, so I'll tailor it slightly so we're not saying the exact same thing. But I do think that one of the things we're missing when we talk about the intersection of LGBTQ rights and religious liberties and religious exemptions is that we already have a really excellent framework for how to think about these types of things in existing federal and state laws. These are not new ideas. This is something that our society has been grappling with when it comes to non-discrimination laws and the extent to which we allow religious entities or religious individuals to assert a right not to comply with those non-discrimination laws. So in addition to the ministerial exception that you referenced, which not only allows churches to make decisions about who, or houses of worship to make decisions about who their religious leaders are, has been interpreted fairly broadly to apply to anybody whose job it is to help perpetuate and carry out the faith. So if you are a teacher at a religious school and part of your job is to help ensure that the religious beliefs of that organization permeate the education, You are a minister. That's part of your job. In contrast, the person who's mopping the floors at 11 o'clock at night is not perpetuating the faith. Even then, our federal employment non-discrimination laws take into account the idea that you might want to have a purely insular religious organization and permit you to limit your hiring to people of your own faith. So if a Catholic school, a Jewish school, a Muslim school wants to say, in order to work here, you have to be a member of our faith, and we as the religious organization get to make decisions about who is and who is not truly a member of our faith, right? I don't get to walk in and say, hey, I think I'm Catholic, I think I'm Jewish. It is the organization itself that gets to make those determinations. We've created that space for people to have community with individuals of their own faith. But when we talk about moving out into the broader world, when we're talking about that janitor, when we're talking about people who are seeking services, we historically have not permitted individuals who are religious to be able to refuse services. The Supreme Court's already tackled this issue. In the 1960s, there was an individual who ran a restaurant, and he had very sincerely held religious beliefs that he shouldn't have to serve certain types of customers. There were 3 customers who walked in who he felt he just could not, because of his religious beliefs, serve. Okay? He even said to them, I'm not going to allow you to have the barbecue that I serve in my restaurant, but you know what? I'll accommodate you by giving you something out the back door. The Supreme Court rejected that as a permissible form of discrimination. They didn't question the sincerity of his religious beliefs. What they said instead is that we have to be able to have non-discrimination laws that eradicate discrimination when people are moving about in public life. Now, that individual was not discriminating against LGBTQ people. He had a sincerely held religious belief that there should be no mixing of the races. And so he wouldn't serve those 3 African Americans in his restaurant with white individuals. Now, that may seem very odious to you today. I would imagine most people sitting here, if not all of us, agree that those attitudes are unacceptable. But they were a sincerely held religious belief by that individual. What he is allowed to do in the privacy of his home, what he is allowed to do if he establishes his own church, establishes a religious school, is very different from what our expectations are when people open themselves up to the general public.
Thanks. I want to begin by thanking Professor Schwartz for inviting me to be part of this conversation, such an important topic, and with such distinguished panelists. I've been a law and religion scholar for about 20 years now, and when I began, the field was relatively small. Small number, or scholars and a small number of advocates who were laboring largely outside of the public view. And we had different opinions, often quite different opinions, but by and large the conversation was congenial. Now, of course, questions of religious liberty have become caught up in the culture wars, and they're front and center of our national conversation. And the paradigm case is no longer the small religious minority who's been ignored or overlooked or targeted by democratic majorities. It's a more familiar phase whose role in shaping public norms has been ebbing for some time with respect to marriage, family, and sexuality, but it's been receding very quickly in recent years. Both of these paradigms have given rise to an important question that's been at the center of debates in the field for many decades, and that is when government laws and regulations serving legitimate public purposes burden religious practice, should we excuse religious believers from the requirements of those laws? And, relatedly, does the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment to our Constitution require relief in some circumstances? In the past, when the paradigm was that of a small religious minority seeking an exemption from a majoritarian rule, religious exemptions, at least as a matter of principle, seemed benign and laudable. Now, though, as today's religious majorities are seeking exemptions from laws promoting new norms regarding marriage, family, and sexuality, things look different to many people inside and outside of the academy. And religious exemptions have met with fierce resistance from those who worry that these exemptions will harm those that the laws are designed to protect, as well as undermine the advancement of equality for LGBTQ persons and women in law, society, and the broader economy. Today's debates about religious exemptions raise important issues that matter to many Americans, and it's not surprising then that our conversations have been intense. However, too often, heated passions in an era of coarsening public rhetoric have impeded our ability to hear what each other have to say, and they've bred a distrust that threatens to make deepened divisions intractable and destabilizing for our life together. So when Professor Schwartz asked me to be part of an event sponsored by the Project on Civil Discourse, I was excited by the opportunity and also by the occasion. Professor Schwartz has asked us to address the paradox of tolerance. That is, if a society is tolerant without limit, its ability to be tolerant is eventually seized or destroyed by the intolerant. And that is surely true, but the good thing about our current disputes right now is something that my fellow panelists have already pointed out. Few participants in our current debates are actually making these kinds of sweeping claims. Religious opponents of same-sex marriage have largely acquiesced to the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell versus Hodges recognizing a constitutional right of same-sex couples to marry. And likewise, while many religious conservatives oppose gender transitioning and related treatments, they haven't sought to ban them. Similarly, conservative religious believers don't object as a general matter to serving or employing LGBTQ persons. Their objections are more narrow. For example, there have been objections to facilitating, affirming, and in some cases recognizing same-sex marriages, and also to facilitating or participating in treatments related to gender transitioning. And for their part, participants and our advocates, for LGBTQ rights haven't sought to force clergy to solemnize marriages between same-sex couples, and as a general matter, they haven't otherwise sought to reach into the purely private spaces of religious institutions, churches, synagogues, and mosques, and like, and you've heard that here. So our debates, you've also heard, are about public settings, public accommodations, commerce, and religious nonprofits serving and employing those of a variety of different faiths. And they're about the ability to live in accordance with one's religious or sexual identities in these places. On the one hand, same-sex couples want to be able to access wedding-related services on the same basis as heterosexual couples, and they want to be treated like heterosexual couples when they approach foster care and adoption agencies, for example. And transgender persons don't want to encounter barriers to medical care. On the other hand, some small business owners don't want to personally provide wedding-related services that they see as expressing approval of same-sex marriage. And some religious institutions don't want to provide foster care services or other services or medical care that they believe violates their religious teachings regarding the nature of marriage and sexuality. So it's in these public places that claims for toleration collide. Religious believers want to be able to follow their faith in public settings, and LGBTQ persons want to be treated as equal citizens in the same spaces. Both want inclusion in public life. And inclusion not at some kind of abstract level, but inclusion as persons whose identities shape their lives in concrete ways and in concrete circumstances. The location of these disagreements provides the key to resolving them. Public places are shared spaces, and they should be shared. How to do this is the stuff of compromise that begins with listening to what others have to say about their experiences, speaking in ways that can be understood, reflecting on what we really need, and working in good faith to find fair and balanced solutions that take account of what matters most to one another. As someone who knows conservative religious communities well, I would predict that over time, a good faith and sustained process of engagement like this would likely also reduce, though by no means eliminate, areas of conflict. Listening to one another's experiences reduces what seems intolerable because it helps us to understand one another. I think we'd also make more progress by exploring the language of rights rather than toleration. In the law and religion field, we usually speak in terms of rights because that's the language of our constitutional tradition. At one level, rights talk might harden disputes, as each side asserts rights against the claim of the other. But rights talk can also express a deeper understanding of the claims that are being made. A right to religious freedom reflects the human capacity to seek the divine and the desire to follow conscience where it leads. And the right to religious freedom respects that capacity. Claims by LGBTQ persons for full inclusion in society reflect the human capacity for moral agency, the ability of persons to reflect upon what it means to live a good life, and the desire to pursue visions of human flourishing that integrate sexuality into the broader pattern of human relationships. Both sides in our conflict seek human goods grounded in human personhood, and if we see it that way, we can do more than tolerate one another. We can respect one another even when we deeply disagree.
Wow. So, first thought is a question for Sarah. So it feels like in this is not going to be a very fire and brimstone panel. So you
Not
have,
yet.
Not yet. All right. Well, maybe. Okay. Well, I'm sitting far enough. So you have a big city that has lots of contracts with lots of providers of services, including foster care, and there are tons and tons of children in the foster care system in the United States. And you have a service provider like Catholic Charities that's been doing this work for a long time, and let's say a big city like DC works with tons of providers, including Catholic Charities, and if they say, okay, we're not actually going to facilitate adoptions or household reviews for married same-sex couples or couples who we deem as a religious provider inconsistent with our faith. And DC is doing business and has contracts with 4 other foster care agencies because that's how high the need is here. What's the position on that exemption? I mean, if there are other places that family can go, and there are agencies that work with them.
Part of this is both about prospective parents, but also the children in care. It is not the best interest of children in care to reduce the number of families that are available to them. There have been some false claims made that by asking organizations that have a religious character to serve all prospective parents, regardless of whether those prospective parents are LGBTQ or of another faith. There's a very significant incident in South Carolina recently in which an agency refused to work with someone who was Jewish, refused to work with someone who was Catholic. Because those individuals didn't conform to the faith of the agency. Now, in that circumstance, the agency is responsible for about 70% of all adoption and foster care in the state. But we need to make sure that as many families as possible are available for children who desperately need care. And there is a dignitary harm to turning people away that harms not only those couples who are seeking to be parents, those individuals who are seeking to be parents who are otherwise qualified, but also a harm to the youth in care, many of whom are LGBTQ. About 40% of runaway and homeless youth are LGBTQ people, and a very significant percentage of those have entered into the foster care system. those kids need to know that they are affirmed, that there's nothing wrong with them for being LGBTQ. And if the agency that is facilitating adoptions or foster care placements is telling them that an LGBTQ parent isn't good enough, what effect does that have on the youth themselves?
Yeah, I think all the interests that you mentioned are important ones. And I guess my take on it, again, and it sort of set it out with what I said at the beginning, was trying to find compromises that can take into account the multiple interests that you mentioned, as well as the concerns of the religious foster care and adoption agencies. And I guess with respect to the children in care, I guess there, if you're having, if the result of imposing an anti-discrimination norm on, say, a Catholic adoption agent or foster care agency is for the agency to close down its services, you are in that way eliminating one of the agencies that has been reaching out to this population, as well as the prospective parents that they reach, and the dignitary harms, that's something I've been thinking about in my mind. I thought, well, how about a situation where the way you enter the foster care system, if you're a prospective couple, is one in which you see the options, right? You see the options, and you can from there reach out to an agency that you feel will best fit you. And there's an indication there that, not that you probably didn't already know it, if you're the prospective couple who's a same-sex couple, the Catholic one wouldn't be a good one for you, so that you don't have to then reach out and get turned away. I mean, obviously the second level would be a referral, but I'm trying to address the dignitary harm where you don't have to go and then get referred. You just, the way everyone enters is they see a panoply of options and they kind of go where it works best for them. And in that way, you have more families participating. You don't shut down any programs. And I think also you'd have to structure it so that the kids who are out there in need of homes would be available to all the parents in the system who would otherwise, fit their needs, that the parents' background fit the kids' needs, so that any particular foster care agency wouldn't kind of have a hold on those kids. So anyone entering into the system and working with an agency that fits their needs would also be able to have access to the kids out there. And in terms of the issues with respect to the kids in the program who are LGBTQ, that is something that I think there would have to be mechanisms in place so that those kids wouldn't end up in a situation where the family was not a good fit because maybe they even ran away because of those reasons, and obviously you wouldn't want to put them back in a situation like that. But I think this is what I like to think about, is how can all of these things be balanced so that you have the religious adoption foster care agencies there, the same-sex couples served, because ultimately helping kids is the important project with foster care agencies. And I feel like all sides in this debate are interested in helping others. They are acting from goodwill, and these are important problems in communities, so we should try to find a way to work together.
One of the concerns that I have about that approach are a couple of things. First, it's not always obvious on the face of it that a particular agency, just because it has a religious affiliation, is unwilling to work with a same-sex couple. There actually are religiously affiliated adoption and foster care agencies that are willing to work with prospective LGBTQ parents. So if we had a system in which we sort of said, here's the array of options that you have and can look at, essentially then what we're asking is for these agencies to put up a sign that says, if you're LGBTQ, you need not apply. I think that's a really ugly space to go back to. We've been there as part of our American history, where shops and other places very publicly displayed that people would not be served based on their religion, based on their race, based on their ethnicity. I don't think, that actually is a solution that gives us a more tolerant and open society. The other challenge, and maybe part of what you're suggesting here works around it, but once these agencies are working with youth through the foster care system, they have to interact with that child's entire family. And it's very distressing to me that we might place a child with a stranger rather than with a loving aunt or uncle because that person is an LGBTQ person. And so we've got to have those mechanisms by which we really are placing kids first. In those states that have requirements that foster care agencies that are contracting with the government not discriminate, it's been very few agencies that have chosen to shut down. The vast majority of them have changed their practices. And in the rare circumstances where they have shut down, it is workers from those agencies who are so skilled and so committed to the best interests of youth that they've actually left and set up their own adoption and foster care agencies. It's incredibly common. This is something that we can't solve. It's something that individual religious institutions are going to have to solve with their practitioners. But in many instances, there is a clear tension between what a hierarchy of a religious organization is asserting and what the people in the pews believe is the right outcome.
I think it's important to draw a distinction, or one distinction that one could draw in this area is the distinction between licensing and funding. There could be situations in which the government refuses to license an adoption agency unless they adhere to anti-discrimination norms. That's really an existential threat to the agency, and it's the government saying, you can't exist, you can't do what you're going to do unless you adhere to, norms that we dictate. I think it's very different when the government says to someone who's receiving government funds, the condition of receiving these funds is that you have to adhere to non-discrimination norms. That in practical terms, that may be an existential threat, but it just seems to make sense to me that if the government is spending money to serve the public, that it has the prerogative to determine how the public will be served. And many of the conflicts that we're talking about involve funding and not licensing, although some do involve licensing. Private religious entities, I think, ought to be entitled to discriminate with their own money, especially if they're serving their own members. But I think it's a bridge too far to say that we need to create space for religiously sponsored social service agencies to enable them to discriminate with the government's money. If the government attaches strings, as it usually does, that requires adherence to anti-discrimination norms, that seems to me to be a good place to draw the line.
I'll take you up on that in a second about the funding issue, because I think you put your finger on an important one, Fred. But back to something Sarah was saying, because it kind of links in, say you enter the system and you see this Planet P of options, and there it is, on paper on the website that this particular agency it does not certify same-sex couples as foster parents. Is that the same thing as saying we don't serve African Americans or what have you? And that's where I think it's not. And this is one of the differences, real, genuine, difficult differences between religious organizations asserting claims for religious exemption or religious individuals and those opposing them. And I guess what I think is at stake there, and this is why I think listening to one another is so important, is that there's a moral disagreement going on about marriage, family, and sexuality. What marriage is it between a man and a woman, or can it be viewed more broadly? And even if you get beyond that question, what is it? You know, what is marriage? Do we step back and think about it? What comes along with marriage? What goods does marriage serve and the like? So it can be deep questions. And so I think when restrictions or limitations on rights are meant to kind of take a moral question and say this answer to the moral question is outside of what we can think about. I guess that's the tolerance issue. That's troubling to me. That's troubling to me. I think, you know, we have a tradition of free speech, pluralism, and the like. So, but when, you know, Fred, you raised the funding question. So, well, okay, so we can license these groups. You want to squash them, but do we fund them? And then I guess, you know, one question would be, well, what are you funding with these adoption agencies? There's a question of, are you funding the home studies or not? And I guess in a lot of cases the government's not funding the home studies, and that's where the discrimination takes place. You know, the funding comes with the serving of the children and the like. So it'd be a question whether there's funding in that particular context. But more broadly, I would look sort of historically and say, you know, religious organizations have contributed a lot to American society. They've done a lot of good, and oftentimes increasingly in conjunction with the government, though much less so in earlier centuries. And do we want to push them out, both as a practical matter and as a matter of shutting down voices that are different? I don't think we want to shut down voices that are different. I think that the gay rights movement has shown that voices that are different and are viewed as intolerable at one time, we see that we were wrong. And you can't always say, probably never can say, you know, this absolutely wrong or not. That's part of living in a pluralistic society. So I think that's one of the big differences. It's a struggle.
Let me just say quickly, I hear this argument a lot, given where I work at Brigham Young University out in Utah, that religions do a lot of good. And I think that's true. I don't dispute that at all. But if we're going to have a consequentialist or utilitarian justification for funding religious activities that may run up against public anti-discrimination values, then we need to sort of net those out all the way along, because religion's been at the base of some bad things that have happened in our history as well. I think we have to list all of those. There are often, there are values that shouldn't be compromised, or at least there are values that we can't balance away by utilitarianism. There are arguments that a better result than Brown versus Board of Education would have been to fund African American schools truly equally with the white schools, and that the educational outcome, especially in the long term, might have been better. And I don't know if that's true or not. You know, I'm not an empiricist or a historian. But let's grant the premise there and say, is that somehow, would that somehow justify school segregation because we have better educational outcomes? And I think the answer has to be no, that there's something wrong with a school system that segregates on the basis of race, and that consequentialist positive consequences or positive utility doesn't alter the fact that it is still wrong.
Just a thought pulling back. One of the things that people who take classes with me know, they know that I like to look for operational definitions. And one of our panelists introduced an idea, and even a potential rule will distinguish between moral questions and other questions. So I guess my question there, and my understanding was that the questions around marriage and who's married and what marriage is for and who can marry or who can marry whom are functioning as a moral question right now. And questions around segregation and race, racial discrimination, things like that are not. So what puts something in the category of moral or religious question as opposed to civil rights question? How would we create a category that had a uniquely religious or moral quality?
You know, that's a really good question. I guess someone with my position, strong religious exemptions, has to struggle with the question of, well, if you're going to make exemptions from civil rights laws with respect to protections for LGBTQ persons, well, then aren't you? I guess it's the Piggy Park case. I think you mentioned. Aren't you just walking right into saying you have to have religious exemptions when the discrimination is racial? And I guess I give the predictable answer in some ways, but I think it's a true one that that racial discrimination is different, and part of the reason I give that answer, though, is if you look at the Christian tradition, those claims that were being made were utterly inconsistent with the long-standing Christian tradition, even with respect to slavery. Christianity was born into a world in which there was slavery, and it tolerated slavery for centuries, and it a long scholarly tradition about the relationship between slaves and masters and the like. But what happened in America with slavery is completely inconsistent with even that moral tradition, which has now been completely debunked, obviously. So I think with religious people are making the claim that LGBTQ issues or marriage and the like involve moral issues, and I think those claims, they're equally, it's age old, right? But the claim that was made in Piggy Park by that particular individual, or the is terrible discrimination in the South based on race, North too, obviously, that doesn't have any, I don't think, any roots, much less strong roots in the Christian tradition. So I would distinguish them on those bases.
So I agree with you that, we shouldn't draw or try to treat LGBTQ people identically to racial discrimination. But I do think they bring important parallels and ways about thinking of things. I would actually encourage us to also look at invidious discrimination against women, discrimination from one religious group to another religious group, as some of the ways that we want to approach this as well. Many of those instances of discrimination are very much rooted in religious traditions. Though not as widely accepted today, there is a profound tradition in many faiths of saying that women are not fully equal with men, that they have very distinct roles from men, and maybe it's not appropriate for women to operate in the workplace in the same way as men. It's historically been used to justify paying women lower wages, excluding women from particular types of jobs. We see it when it comes from discrimination between religious groups and maybe even just individuals who don't like individuals of other groups that sometimes use their own faith traditions as a rationale for discriminating. And that brings me back, and I don't want to sort of fixate on this issue of foster care agencies, but it is just sort of a great of-the-moment example of an agency that refused to work with people who are of a different faith tradition of them, despite the fact that they're operating in the public sphere. And so I do think we have to be thoughtful, right, that it is moral beliefs, it is religious traditions that affect what almost all of us do at some level. Even if you're an atheist or agnostic, that doesn't mean people don't have a moral compass, right? And that the court has very much recognized lack of a religion is protected just in the same way that being of a particular religious tradition is under the First Amendment. So I do think we have to think about morality more broadly. And the fact that when it comes to civil rights, it is actually people's religious and moral traditions that has encouraged many Americans to fight on behalf of civil rights, including but not limited to LGBTQ people.
So I'm not that old, but I was born in the 1950s, and so I grew up in sort of that idyllic era that many conservative religions are always sort of implicitly appealing to. And the idea that racial discrimination would be so publicly condemned that someone like Trent Lott would have to resign as Senate Majority Leader, or that people would be drawing distinctions between racial discrimination that's so different from all the, I mean, that was just unthinkable in the 1950s and the 1960s for that matter. And it's really the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, all in the 1960s that not only guaranteed rights for African Americans and others, but I think started to change attitudes in the United States. I guess this is all to say that, you know, whether a moral question is something about which we'll tolerate diversity and whether it isn't, and how things move from one category to another, and that's very much relative to time and place, that those attitudes are socially constructed. So one way to think about the situation that we're in now is that we're in a transition space analogous to the transition from racial segregation to racial discrimination in the 1960s and 1970s. And conservative religious people who have traditional views about marriage and family feel under siege. I mean, I think it, for generations, for centuries, those views were the cultural backdrop to everything that happened in the United States and, frankly, in the West. And now, all of a sudden, not only are these denominations not the arbiters of public morality, but they're now the minority. They feel under attack. I don't know what will happen in another 50 years because, you know, the narrative of progress, I mean, it's like lots of other myths we have, and I don't think everything's going to go slowly to nirvana. We could back up. There are all sorts of things that could happen. But I guess we could imagine that, well, I just think of my own church, which frankly had really retrograde ideas about race during my lifetime when I was in college. And now they're engaging in partnerships with the NAACP, and they haven't changed fundamental doctrines, but clearly there's been a shift in how they think about this and how they have reincorporated or rethought through the idea of race. I think that is likely to happen even with many conservative religions. Though maybe not Roman Catholics.
Yeah, I mean,
the 2,000-year history of natural law reasoning about the family.
Yeah, I was thinking about Catholicism. I'm Catholic when Fred was talking about his faith, and I think that, you know, we're on a clear trajectory of within conservative religious communities of learning to live with each other's differences, even though, you know, there's always like that, right? You know, I think that one of my points, the more we know about one another, the more we learn about one another, the more it helps that. But I don't necessarily think that that means that we're all going to agree, or Catholics are going to give up their understanding of marriage as between a man and a woman, though I don't know, actually. But the thing that comes to my mind is divorce, right? So in the Catholic tradition, if you are married in the church and you divorce, it's very difficult to get remarried in the church. And what we're really debating about now is access to communion, which in my mind is a no-brainer. You should be able to have communion in the church, but that's what we're arguing about. And will we ever be at a point where the Catholic Church will say, well, you know, you're divorced, remarried? I don't think we will. So, but anyway, these are the great questions that religious traditions struggle with. And I think that one of the things that I think is important is, and I don't think either of you are really disputing this, is that religious traditions have the space to struggle with their questions about how human life is to be lived and how that relates to how they understand God's revelation in the world. One of the things, Fred, you just mentioned was sort of the fear factor, and I think you have to put that into the utilitarian calculus right now. The sense that conservative religious believers have that they're under threat, it is very dangerous. It has, in my mind, justified all sorts of positions and steps that I would view as unjustifiable, but they happen all the time. And they are harmful for all of us. And I don't think we want a community in which large groups of Americans feel that they're under threat, even if we deeply disagree with who they are. It's very destabilizing. So that's part of the utilitarian calculus for me.
So I'm thinking that we have a great audience here ready to ask questions, and that we could just release a mic into the crowd and get you engaging actually with them.
That's right.
Who's got something?
Pass this back to Eliza back there.
I have a question for Kathleen, right? Just in terms of what you were talking about with like adoption agencies and having couples sort of like choose their own thing. I just sort of wonder, like, what's the line between requiring an agency or some institution to not discriminate, and then having people whose those discrimination laws are protecting, having them sort of be in charge of not facing their own discrimination. Like, I just sort of wonder, like, where that line is between, like, asking someone to not enter, to, like, protect themselves from discrimination, and, like, asking them to sort of, like, not be discriminated against. I just think that that's, like, a really dangerous line to cross, and I just sort of wonder, like, where that exists in your mind. Or, I mean, this is sort of a question for everyone, but...
Yeah, I think it'd be a religious accommodation, right? So as an accommodation, an exemption, although in this case I guess you'd call it an exemption, broader category of accommodation. It's making adjustments. It is making adjustments to our anti-discrimination rules to make room for religious adoption agencies, which now have minority positions on this. So it's give and take, right? So yeah, there's some take there and there's some give there, and I don't deny it. But I sort of started out with this idea of shared space and sharing the space, and that requires some give and take. I don't deny that.
I guess my question is sort of more like, how much space are you giving to people who are actively trying to take up the space of a historically marginalized group? And then also sort of part of that is, with those people who are historically marginalized, how much do you ask them to avoid
Right.
this?
Well, in the cases that have the South Carolina one with the religious discrimination, that's sort of a different issue, and demographically it's different too. I'm not as familiar with that. I know vaguely about that case, but in there, I guess it's a Protestant agency. They have they take up a lot of the space in terms of the agency and the children involved, and so to exclude other religions is quite significant, I think. But sort of with the LGBTQ issues, focusing on those, in the cases in the North Mid-Atlantic, in those situations, the number of agencies that object to certifying same-sex couples is a small fraction of the overall number of agencies, and I think it matters, right? To me, it matters that that same-sex couples would have access to the foster care system. And so if there were no agencies willing to work with same-sex couples, you'd have to come up with some kind of an accommodation. If you could, that would address that problem. And where would I draw the line? I guess I wouldn't want to like draw the line because I'm always trying to figure out solutions. I love a puzzle, you know, so to try to figure out a way to make it work. But you put your finger on something very important. No, you can't block. If religious exemptions mean blocking other people out of the shared space, it's not sharing anymore.
Pass the microphone ahead of you.
Okay, I still don't, oh, it is working now. Okay, I don't even know if I'm going to use this. I'm like right in front of you guys. But basically, like, bouncing off of the same idea of like this foster care system in which, yes, Catholic organizations may not allow LGBT people to adopt, but like maybe they should just pick their own. I think that when you look at things from this like utilitarian point of view that you guys have all been discussing, it kind of is difficult to ignore that a lot of the impacts that are taken by like religious exemptions happen to be the same religion. And like there are clearly more hegemonic discourses of like Catholicism than there are of other religions in this context when we provide those religious exceptions. So on that idea of like impacts, when some organizations, and like you mentioned, there's like some states where it is far more difficult to find organizations that are not Catholic that are going to allow you to adopt. How do we reckon with that in our policy and in our implementation of policy in a way that does protect all religions equally when there has been such a shift in power towards certain religions over others in the past in the United States?
I mean, so one of the things I would say is I think there needs to be non-discrimination on the basis of religion, as well as non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. I'm deeply troubled by this agency that is turning people away based on their religion. We have an environment which, because of historical and I think you could argue continuing preferences for Christian traditions over other religious traditions, that those agencies that are in the child welfare space, but also many other spaces too, running homeless shelters, running emergency shelters for people, running hospitals, major hospital systems, are disproportionately Christian traditions. And so you don't actually have a marketplace in which people can seek services on an equal footing and an equal playing field. And I don't think that those religious institutions who are operating with public dollars, operating in the public space, should be able to turn people away, whether that's because they're LGBTQ or because they're of a different religious tradition. And if the flip were true, right, let's say you happen to have a community in which Jewish people or Muslim people were the majority and the bulk of the institutions reflected the majority population, those traditions shouldn't be able to exclude Christian couples or Christian individuals who want to be a part of providing long-term solutions for kids. They shouldn't be able to reject people who are in emergency situations and need to find shelter.
I would like to say something in partial defense of Catholics. Catholics were once a powerless, persecuted minority in the United States, and much of what we observe, Kathleen can speak to this better than I can, but much of what one can observe about Catholic institutions is the result of having to create their own school systems, having to deal with pervasive institutional discrimination in the United States. It was respectable in academic circles into the 1960s to be anti-Catholic. So this is not something from the distant past. It's also the case that not everywhere in the United States, but in many places in the United States, the only hospitals and medical clinics that would serve African Americans on the same basis as others were Catholics. And so there's there's some ironies about the idea that now Catholics are, are hegemonic institutions that are out of step with public values when in some respects they were ahead of public values. And I just offer that as an observation. I don't know that I can draw any conclusions from it, but it's, I think, something to keep in mind.
And it is the wonderful Catholic tradition of providing options for the poor that has resulted in so many, although certainly not exclusively, the agencies providing these services being Catholic, right? It is that commitment to dignity for poor people, which is really quite radical at the time these institutions were established, that created a little bit of the dichotomy that we're in right now.
Mm-hmm. I'll just throw out one tiny little point, and it's not in praise of Catholics. Like, I don't take it personally. I'm just a little person. But I think that one of the things that you put your finger on is what I mentioned at the beginning, the paradigm shift, right? Paradigm shift away from religious exemptions protecting the small minority who's been overlooked or targeted by democratic majorities, versus now we're in a situation where we have previously quite powerful, perhaps not as you folks point out, previously not powerful, but nevertheless, in the grand scheme of things, recently more powerful, losing power, but wanting exemptions from laws that now reflect new norms, right? And so I think it's important when developing principles for how to deal with religious exemptions to think in terms of rules that would protect both of these groups. In other words, if you think, oh, it is a powerful group, and then you have a principle, and tomorrow the principle is not very helpful when it comes term to the small minority, right? So the rules that we develop should be able to cross over those differences.
There we go. Hi, Professor Brady. I was hoping to turn back quickly to the comparison to historical anti-miscegenation doctrine. I hear your point that in the modern era, there's been debunking of the, or discrediting of the theological interpretation behind that. But at the time, I think you'd agree it was a sincerely held religious belief. So I guess turning more to like the legal litmus test that should be applied, are you suggesting the government should be involved in like the theological debates and the underpinnings of these doctrines? Or what's the litmus test?
That's actually a really great question, because I stand by what I said, but as you're saying, when we're, say we're talking about policy or a constitutional right, are we going to say, well, this one has a real foundation in Christian tradition and this one doesn't? And I actually don't think that we need to. I think another of the problematic facets of exemptions in a context of protections for racial minorities is our history in America and what those exemptions would mean. It's one thing to say we need exemptions in a context in which there are plenty of other options. We can square that with a shared space, and it's another thing when there's a long tradition of discrimination, a pattern of discrimination, where exemptions, especially back in the 1960s, I mean, that would have just blown a hole right through the whole rule. But would religious exemptions today mean that? It depends on how you tailor them, and that's part of the question. But I don't think that they would have to, and I think part of the reason you see very rapidly changing views, right? So that's why you get the sense from religious conservatives that they're under threat. Things have changed so fast. So I think there's a different history there that makes race different, and as well as just the theological thing, which you're right is very problematic if you try to operationalize that for a constitutional principle or other legal principle.
I can't reemphasize enough that I do, think race and the experiences of people based on race are different than experiences based on LGBTQ status. But there is a history and tradition of discriminating against LGBTQ people that's very troubling. I mean, it wasn't until 2003 in this country that LGBTQ people could go anywhere in this country and not be at risk of being declared a criminal, put in jail, simply for engaging in an intimate relationship with a person that they loved. We are not in a situation in which LGBTQ people were going merrily along and then all of a sudden there's a change in norms or understanding. There is a pattern and practice of discrimination. The government refusing to hire people who were LGBTQ, rooting out people who were LGBTQ for ostracization and to be fired. And this has been going on for a very significant part of American history and continues to today. We are not in a situation in which LGBTQ people have full rights in this country and are able to operate as members of public society without fear of discrimination, harassment, and frankly, for some members of our community, tremendous violence.
And I will say, you are right. I should not minimize the experience of LGBTQ people. And I think things are changing very rapidly, but nevertheless, the history is not a good one. And that's why, for me, dignitary harms matter, even if at a constitutional level, I'm troubled by it because of the free speech, free expression, pluralism, points of view. I think they matter at the level of how we solve problems. Because it is different when you're a heterosexual couple. You can just, go into any shop you want, taste any cake you want. You don't even give it a second thought. It matters that same-sex couples do not have that same carefree attitude about planning weddings. So that does matter to me.
Let me just add something into this. One of the oddities of the current situation is that LGBT rights to public accommodations are being litigated in the context of an event that happens once or twice in someone's entire life. The vast majority of Americans, the people who are least successful at marriage in the United States get married 3 or 4 times. That's the vast majority get married once or twice or never, and so we're litigating this. It's like the tail is wagging the dog. What Kathleen expressed very well, I think, is the dignity being denied to LGBTQ persons is not just that they are personally insulted when they refuse service, but that they lack the equality of other Americans who don't even think about freely circulating through society to satisfy their legitimate needs and wants because they're not denied. You shouldn't have, setting aside things that happen occasionally, you shouldn't have to do reconnaissance before you go shopping to ensure that you're going to be treated fairly or respectfully or those sorts of things. And that, I think, is a dignitary harm that, I'm really not in a position to speak from personal experience, but it seems to me that that's a dignitary harm that is worse than personal insult.
I think it's also important to note that it isn't just limited to dignitary harm. Many of the proposals that we have seen, that is what is now law in Mississippi, is about allowing individuals and organizations, particularly religious organizations that have increasingly become our nation's social safety net, to discriminate based on their views about what constitutes a marriage. So how does that play out in practice? What that means is if you are a same-sex couple fleeing a hurricane along the Gulf of Mississippi, an agency that is being funded by the government can say, I don't recognize your marriage. I don't recognize you as married, and therefore I'm not going to allow you to shelter in family housing. We're going to have to split up your family. You can't have this room. You can go into a bunkhouse. It means that trans people who are homeless are not permitted to be in shelters consistent with their gender identity, which is where they and everybody else are safest. So it is real harms and not just dignitary harms that come out of many of these policy proposals.
Get the microphone forward, pass it forward. Okay.
question. Hi, this is for Kathleen. So I just want to clarify a few things that you said before I ask my question. So one of the proposed solutions to the foster care agency issue we've been talking about is, you said, basically, in short, separate services. And so you've also said during the course of this lecture that you think race and sexuality are different in kind. And so in your view, other than race, what classes are protected from a sort of, for lack of a better phrase, separate but equal doctrine?
Yeah, I don't think I would call it separate services, because part of what I'm saying is that the vast majority of foster care agencies are serving both same-sex couples and heterosexual couples. So what you're doing is you're making an accommodation, you're making space for a religious agency to abide by its understanding of marriage, right, as between a man and woman, which is actually a positive thing. You're allowing it to abide by its understanding of marriage. But
what I meant was you brought up sort of they could look at a list or look at a website and choose sort of who would be open to them using the service. Is that a fair characterization of what you said?
yeah, although I think more broadly, when couples work with foster care agencies, agencies will specialize in different areas, right? So some have a specialization with LGBTQ families, for example. Some have a specialization with children to speak different languages, I would assume. So in any event, there's specialization. So it could be part of a broader thing in any event. But what I am saying that you would be aware that this is, say, a Catholic agency, and it's going to follow its understanding of marriage. So I mean, separated in that way, I guess so. But what other thing? That's sort of an interesting question, because I'd almost have to see it, right? I'd have to see what the discrimination claim is. I mean, the question of sex is an interesting one, just gender, like men, women, right? And so it is very true that within religious organizations, there, particularly conservative ones, there's different treatment of men and women, say as employees even. But outside, there's not that kind of, I don't see it happening a lot where, an evangelical Christian organization would treat those who are not, shared members differently based upon sex, or they haven't thought about that, right? I mean, they'll usually sign the anti-discrimination statements pretty readily, except for when it comes to LGBTQ. So I don't really know. I'd have to see the question.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, yeah, I'm just making sure the mic gets to people.
All right, cool. So I was actually kind of curious about, people have been talking about sort of hegemonic discourse and the idea that, what if we were protecting certain religions' rights because of their prominence in the country, not focusing on the rights of religious people in general. And I'm just sort of curious about what you guys see as the world of ecumenism. And for people who don't know what that means, that's a theological term. It's sort of about how different faiths can come together along shared values and along just sort of wanting to maintain relations and have a community as people of faith as that particular identity. And I also am curious about, I don't want to say demography is destiny, right? But, when we look at the United States, in general, we are becoming less religious. Most Americans do not attend a regular Sunday service. Very few, slightly more Americans attend some sort of religious service than do not attend Sunday service in particular. So we know for a fact that there is a larger community of believers out there who aren't necessarily Christian. And I'm curious as to how their sort of concerns about Jewish and Muslim and what other communities have having this sort of conversation, because I do think, especially among Orthodox Judaism and evangelical Christianity, there is a significant overlap in terms of values. in terms of, what it means to be good and what it means to be in accordance with, God's law. And I'm genuinely curious as to what you think that role is, especially since, in most of these conversations we're talking about a Christian organization. I'm not really sure what cases have maybe prompted this, but I am curious as to where we can draw the line in that respect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, just at a practical level, there is a lot of overlap on sort of the conservative moral values among sort of more conservative religious traditions, and they have sort of worked together in the advocacy world. But I'm all for I guess you call it ecumenism, I call it ecumenicism. I'm all for it. And part of what I'm proposing is...
Your pronunciation could very well be right.
I don't know.
I've heard both.
Yeah. Can 100% confirm without a doubt that I know that.
I don't either. I don't.
Additionally, if I could just throw in one more wrench into the gears in this conversation. What do you make of the fact that there are conservative religious traditions and there are sort of more openly liberal religious traditions, and how they might see the question of adoption in terms of same-sex couples might be very different.
Oh, yeah.
Despite the fact that they share similar religious values, because at a certain point it becomes state money, and then when you look at evangelical Christianity and the money that they have to spend on mega churches and stuff like that, you kind of have to ask the question, well, do you actually need state money if you have these large religious organizations like the Catholic Church, for example? That's my last question. You guys prompted a lot of interesting thoughts for me.
Yeah, I'm gonna let them answer. Other than just say, I won't answer. Other than say, I do love ecumenicism. I think we should be talking liberal, conservative, whatever within churches. There are shared values, and I think we should be talking religious, non-religious, because we have shared values as a community. It's very important that I think we recover those values and embrace them.
Well, let's just take some more questions.
Kenyatta in front of you. Can you send your hand up for a while?
I can always think of something to say.
In red.
I'm so confused. Hi, is it on? Hello? Okay. I'm from Mississippi, born and raised, and recently, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago now, we passed a law known as HB 1523 that basically legalized that you can discriminate on the basis of your religious views. And so we've had instances like interracial couples being turned away from being able to rent an apartment or a home or being able to marry at a certain church. And I found out recently that the University of South Mississippi has on their job applications, if you have a same-sex partner, they may not receive health insurance benefits from us, even though they're not religiously affiliated and they receive state money. So I'm wondering, under the grounds of allowing people to decide who they can and can't serve, where is the line drawn? Because people are being denied health benefits, they're being denied homes in the poorest state in the nation. So where is the line drawn between respecting people's religious freedom and not allowing people to be homeless or without health insurance?
Yeah. One of the things I would say is I think it's very reflective of the fact that we have not tackled discrimination in this country on so many levels. So the actual legislation in Mississippi, what is law, only permits religious organizations to discriminate against people based on their belief that marriage is between one man and one woman, that sex is set at birth, right, that you basically can't be a transgender person, and that, sex should happen within a marriage. That's it. And yet there is so much hostility still on the basis of race. There is still conflating religious views with race discrimination that we are seeing widespread effects on communities of color, despite the fact it is not what the legislature contemplated, and technically not what the law is. But I think it also shows us how hard it is to draw these lines, to allow people to discriminate based on some ideas that some Americans aren't entitled to equal treatment under the law and the ability to fully live their lives versus other Americans. I mean, it really is a slippery slope. How do we draw these lines? Because Americans don't recognize them as legitimate lines.
I just quickly, I think the Mississippi law went way too far. I think it provided protections where there weren't really needs, and it's exactly the sort of thing I'm not advocating for. So, yeah.
I think this will be the last one.
So like just what you were discussing is, my question is, when do religious organizations, churches, become accountable for their beliefs? Like you spoke about, you know, in the Catholic Church, divorce is not acceptable. When is it okay for now someone, let's say we go to the extreme, for someone to say, you're divorced, I don't want to serve you, or I don't want to offer you the availability to, you know, foster a child, or to get a wedding cake for your second marriage? I think, you know, when do people in these religious organizations now have to be accountable for their beliefs and not just be able to pick and choose which of their beliefs they're going to follow and when they want to discriminate towards them?
That's an excellent question, and American constitutional doctrine makes an answer almost impossible. Federal and state courts are prohibited from answering theological questions. And I mean, I had a note here. I mean, this is what makes complicity claims so hard, is that somebody says, well, the government's not making me do anything, but my religion teaches me that I'm accountable for something that someone else does 3 or 4, you know, layers down in the chain of causation, and therefore I should be exempt. And yet the courts can't really evaluate that. Many of you probably heard Beto O'Rourke suggest that religions that don't recognize same-sex marriages should have their tax exemptions revoked. So, I mean, if there's a third rail of American politics from the standpoint of religious institutions, that's it, the tax exemption. And we do have the Bob Jones case. And Bob Jones was not integrated with or affiliated with a church, and I don't think the IRS anytime soon is going to go after an actual church for its tax exemption. But I do think in the long run that any organization, religious or not, whose values are perceived to be corrosive of widely shared values is at risk of losing its tax exemption.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again? I just wanted to make sure I heard what you said.
I think in the long run that any organization, whether it's religious or not, whose values are are corrosive, so it's a matter of degree, I guess, of widely shared public values, has its tax exemption will be at risk. I'm thinking, so, I read something. Part of the problem with the digital age is I can't remember where I read anything because it just, but I read something from a respectable news source that there are still white supremacy organizations that have tax exemptions, and the question raised is a legitimate one. Should American taxpayers subsidize that sort of activity? Is it really in the public interest, which is the justification for tax exemptions? So I'm not suggesting that any church, any mainstream church is equivalent with white supremacists, but I mean, one could certainly imagine 50 or 100 years from now, a United States in which discrimination against same-sex couples is now on a par with racial discrimination, and you know, I think religions need to think about that. That's one way in which they might be held accountable.
I'm going to disagree slightly. You know, the way that the tax code operates, the way the IRS operates, revocation of tax-exempt status virtually never happens. And even with respect to new organizations that are applying to become tax-exempt, refusing to allow that tax-exempt status to be adopted is extraordinarily rare. In the past 30 years, it's something like 30 organizations. And these often have to do with things like violation of child labor laws. Again, it's extraordinarily rare. And we have very strong public policy against certain types of sex discrimination, against certain types of discrimination on the basis of religion. And the IRS has never reached in and said, hey, as a religious organization, you violate these principles that the U.S. increasingly holds dear, and we're going to take away your tax-exempt status. I just don't think that it's something that's going to become widespread. There may be very rare instances, like a Bob Jones University, where it is used, but again, I think it's extraordinarily unlikely and extraordinarily rare.
I completely agree. The only thing I would say is now is not 100 years from now. And who knows 100 years from now.
Yeah. I actually agree with you, Sarah. I do find it problematic to sort of categorize, well, these are just the really terrible ones, so corrosive of public values. Because a gentleman up there was talking about drawing those kinds of lines problematic. But I will just say, back to my point about fear, that statement by Beto O'Rourke, I have my contacts in the conservative religious communities, and it was just like, you want to make people crazy, say something like that, you know? And it's not helpful. It doesn't help anyone in the long run when people go crazy. So, yeah.
Thank you all very much.